I thought I'd start off with this slide. It's one of my favorite ones from Gaping Void. It's not my favorite of all time. His best one, which if you ever have a conference call, you'll see on the wall behind me in the study, is same cross, different nails, which is quite brilliant if you think about it, all right? And one of the things, and I'm going to come back to this later, is what art does or aesthetics does is it moves you into a different way of thinking. Yeah, and that's going to be important. Remember, design thinking is about innovation. And part of the point I'm trying to make here is all paths up are different, all paths down are the same. One of the problems we've got at the moment is that design thinking has effectively become a commodity. It's become a highly structured linear process being rolled out without regard to actually its origins or anything else. Now what I'm going to do is having done a brief summary, I'm going to talk about what's called apex predator theory, which is one of the radical new approaches in corporate strategy, but it's mainly designed to say, when can you innovate? Remember, complexity is all about context-specific, not context-free. There are times when there's no point in trying to do something new because the system is too stable. So apex predator theory is all about knowing when you can innovate and how not to, and it's that sort of side of it. Then I'll move into the work we've been doing for the last year on design thinking, and that's been with Stanford and MIT and other people. Because everybody I know who actually is a genuine professor of design is appalled by what Adeo are doing. Yeah, it's sort of a massive compromise in what design is meant to be. So we've been working with them on that, and I'm going to finish off with some general points. Right? So starting off with a basic summary, and I thought the philosophers amongst you will recognize that, all right? It's one of my favorite, being as becoming, right? Yes, there's a few nods around the room. This concept of flow, which underpins Cynefin, is actually quite important. Yeah, it's not a static process, it's a continuously changing process, which is why resilience is actually quite important. So to run some stuff, remember I said a complex system is dispositional, not causal. That has major implications for the whole idea of change, because it means any attempt to set a corporate goal is a waste of time. Yeah, you might want to do it because you might want to have a poster with some nice words on it, and everybody should have those. But the fundamental issue in a complex system is the dispositional state ready for change? Is it prone to transformational change? Because if it's about to go through a phase shift, it could change very rapidly, very quickly for a very small input. Or is it relatively stable? So none of these things are absolute, and I don't have a problem with the concept of cultural transformation. It's just it's not often possible. Yeah, and it has to be catalyzed. It can't be designed in that sense of the word. Yeah. Can I come on to that, because that's what scaffolding is about, right? What I'm going to argue is the reality is all organizational design is actually scaffolding, even if it pretends not to be. So we better be authentic about that and look at different typologies of scaffolding. Yep, so I'll come on to that. Yeah. The other critical thing is this shift from thinking about yep. Okay, can I come to that when I come to it? Okay. Okay, cool. Oh, sorry, it was a literal translation. Yeah, okay, sorry, apologies for that. Right? Transformation from individual to linkages is absolutely critical. Yeah, for the philosophers and theologians amongst you, that actually means communitarianism wins out over social atomism. Yeah, you're defined by the people you grow up with; they're not defined by you, and that's been a fundamental divide for about 300 or 400 years. You may not think it's significant, but more people have died over that distinction in politics and religion than anything else in wars. Yeah. But fundamentally, how people interact has a bigger influence on them than what they are. Yeah? And as I said yesterday, that actually means intervention is more ethical, because I think it's legitimate for an organization to define interactions, but I'm really dubious about this HR attempt to try and change people. Yeah? I don't think it's ethical, and the good news is it won't work, all right? Yeah? Okay. Secondly, it's critical to see different perspectives. And you can't do that from your own point of view. You can't train yourself to see things from different perspectives consistently. We just don't do that. This is the realism. So you have to find mechanisms by which you can see things from different perspectives and critically identify outliers early. Remember the 17% who see the gorilla? You need to find them before you go too far. So this is an example. I showed you one of these yesterday. This is actually from a big thing we did for PricewaterhouseCoopers. This is their worldwide survey of attitudes among CEOs, yeah, which we actually did with Sensemaking. We got some interesting stuff on that, by the way, because what triads did is they forced people to decide what was important. So the previous year, the 3 triad labels actually had 3 Likert scales. Everybody scored them all as equally important. When we put them onto a triangle, some of them just disappeared. Yeah, so you got more subtlety. But here you can see the user fitness landscapes to identify radical differences between different countries. Yeah? And you can see at the bottom, we're moving between machine algorithms and human judgment. This was all about the role of AI. So actually, as you increase the level of human judgment you're bringing into the system, the landscapes again change. And I'm trying to show that as this concept of dynamics. Yeah? You're trying to look at what the pattern is, the dispositional pattern, before you make a decision. And this is actually quite significant. If you look at China, for example, yeah, in that, and there's some more on this. If it's Japan, you've got distinct points of view with no connections, yeah, and so on. So that gives you a sense of dispositional state. Yeah. Next one, Cynefin. My definition of sense making is how do we make sense of the world so that we can act in it. The most critical thing, therefore, is to know what type of system you're in. Now, somebody asked a question earlier about which. Well, to be honest, if you have to ask the question, assume it's complex is one thing. But the key thing on Cynefin is to break things down to the right level of granularity so they fit in one domain or other. Yeah, you don't start with a big problem and say, oh, that problem is complex. You say, which aspects of this problem are complicated, which aspects are complex. Yeah? And there's a whole process for that you can look at called 5 points construction, which is trained, in which we define the framework by stories from the organization's own history. So we define both the domains and the boundary conditions by their own, they're called exemplar stories. Because it's much easier to say, well, it's like this, therefore we agreed it was complex, than to actually ask a sort of more abstract language. So the narrative-based definition, by the way, is one of the most important things coming out of this work. People find it much easier to understand things through micro-narratives than they do through structured text. Yeah, so that kind of like is building on that. Next thing I went into, this is dealing with the wicked problems issue. I don't like the phrase wicked problems. I prefer to call them intractable. I like language which tells you what to do. I don't like language which is kind of quasi-mystic. Right? The point about wicked problems is not that they're insolvable, but they're intractable. They're difficult to get a grip on. Yeah? And that's actually where complexity is its best, because as you increase the diversity, remember parallel safe-to-fail experiments? Intractable problems become quite tractable. The problem is we try and solve them by linear processes or find single solutions. Or, to be honest, and this is a different disagreement between me and Marcus, yeah? Systems thinking has always tried to create systems models to say how to solve a problem. Complexity thinking actually says that's clearly a mistake because you're putting too much structure in place, yet too early. Therefore, you're not going to see the outliers, yeah, in that sense. Next one, evolutionary potential of the present. I'm going to talk a lot about that. But one of the problems we got here is the dominance of behavioral economics, which really worries me. I once said, you guys don't nudge, you yank. Yeah, what they actually do is they decide where they want you to be and they try and manipulate you in that pathway. And this is a growing problem as behavioral economics grows. Yeah, it's kind of like a betrayal of the original book to some extent. What you should be realized by now, if you can map the dispositional state, you know when the system is ready to be nudged. And what we're doing with the transgenerational pairing in South Wales is not even to design the nudges centrally, but to get the people to design their own nudges. Yeah? So that nudge not yank concept is absolutely key if you actually want to give people some sort of autonomy or agency within the way they're working. Transformation and phase shifts. Now I'm going to come on to that with apex predator theory, and I've mentioned it already, but it's critical. A system can change very quickly. We actually were doing a narrative capture in Egypt before the Arab Spring, again using children's ethnographers. And I remember sitting down in Whitehall and presenting the results. Yeah? And basically it was very simple. You could see the landscape was stable, but it was stable because of multiple self-cancelling instabilities. And we basically wrote the report and said one small event could trigger a massive shift in this system. Yeah? And one of the things fitness landscapes allow you to do is to identify when a system is ready to change radically so that you can either prevent it or encourage it. Yeah, and that was about 3 months before the guy burnt himself. Yeah? And again, you have to think about those events as catalysts, not as causality. Yeah, but people confuse catalysts and causes all the time, yeah, in terms of the way it works. Yeah? So that dispositional stuff, transformation stuff is key. And then also kind of like there's limits and dangers on natural sciences, all right? The more we know about this, the more danger there is on manipulation, yeah? I said yesterday, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which is where Soma comes from. Yeah, actually the evidence is Huxley saw it as a utopia, not a dystopia, in which the majority of the people take drugs just to stay happy so that everything works. And if you actually read the second book, Raven, you can see the development on that as a utopia. Two things to throw in on this, which is kind of like to argue things can change faster. Material engagement theory is one of the most interesting things to come out of the mixture of anthropology, cognitive neuroscience, and archaeology. We now know that, for example, the capacity for abstract number in human beings actually wasn't in the brain until after the Sumerians created clay counting tablets. Because it was only when we created tools which removed the mechanics of counting that the possibility of abstract number emerged, and then the brain developed the capacity. Yeah? And actually there's evidence now that within a single generation we're seeing neurological changes as a result of smartphones. So tools are really important for human beings. We say kind of like, okay, we are Homo sapiens, yet we're not Homo economicus, but we're also Homo faber, Homo ludens, and Homo narrans. So for those of you not into the Latin on this, yeah, we're jokers, we're tool users, we're storytellers, yeah, and we got intelligence, right? But it's all of those things in combination that actually work. So it's quite dangerous on this. The tools you give people can actually change them in their own lifetime. Yeah? That's why it's so cruel to give people Microsoft Windows. All right, so confirmed Apple user. Yeah. But it is a serious issue, all right? And we now know that there are actually epigenetic effects. How many people know about epigenetics? Okay, it's one of the most scary things coming out of biology, all right? So if you give bright mice the children of dumb mice to bring up, the children of the dumb mice are bright. There's a famous phrase on this, I think it's Kierkegaard, nature may deal the cards, but nurture plays them. Yeah? But we now actually know your RNA structure gets changed by culture. So Lamarck was right. And interestingly, Darwin always said he would be. If you look at Darwin's notebooks, he says culture must inherit, we just don't know the mechanism. Well, the mechanism is RNA, not DNA. Yeah, Eva's work in Egypt, if you haven't read a book on epigenetics, it's to my mind, one of the great classics, all right? It basically, she's shown that the language you speak in your own lifetime changes your RNA and your children inherit. And in social terms, this is actually really scary because it means educational and sociological differences become biological and they're difficult to reverse. So if you've got 3 generations of unemployment and actually eating cheap food, which is bad for you, obesity is now a biological disposition, not a sociological disposition, with all the implications that come from that. Yeah? So I put that out because we need to be worried about this. And what I'm going to argue going through this is the more like this, fewer like that change mechanism actually doesn't have to worry about chemicals or neuroreceptors or anything else because it's going to handle all of those as you go through. Yeah? We know that some of the chemical changes, which was well summarized last time, but some of those actually don't work unless there are also neurological changes. We know that trust is largely determined by pheromone pickup. So the way people smell makes a difference to whether you trust them or not, which is why virtual communication is a problem, because just as my children can't smell snow, we may be about to create a generation that doesn't actually have the mechanisms for trust. Yeah, so this concept of keeping varieties within the system. So I just thought I'd do a sort of, the phrase in English, a dire prognostication section on this, yeah, just to depress you all, right? Okay, so let's start off on the design thinking. Now again, a complex systems approach to this basically says the context is everything. So you can't have a process which says, if we go through this, we will innovate. Because if the system isn't ready to innovate, it won't change anyway. Yep. So what I want to do is to run through this, yeah? And I'm going to start with some statistics, then do apex predator theory. And I'm going to do it on risk first, because that's the easiest way to explain it, right? So if I look at risk, most people measure risk by using this thing called a bell curve. Everybody recognize a bell curve? All God's children love bell curves, right? The reason we like bell curves is we can eliminate anything here as a low probability exceptional event. Yeah? And if we manage stuff in this phase, we've done everything that can be reasonably required of us. This is actually the basis of most computer search algorithms and everything else. Yeah? It's kind of like go to the center of a normal distribution, which is what a bell curve is, a type of Gaussian distribution. Yeah? And provided we manage in the center of that distribution, it's a reasonable thing to do. This is kind of like the standard. Now, there's a problem with this, because if I do a double log scale of size against frequency of virtually any natural phenomena, so there are a lot of small earthquakes, a small number of large earthquakes, yeah, a lot of small software errors, a small number of large software errors, a lot of small floods, a small number of large floods, and so on, then I actually get a distribution pattern which looks like this. And I can draw a straight line through that, which is called a power law. It's not straight here, and that's significant. Yeah? And that's called that's a type of Pareto distribution. So virtually all human phenomena tend to follow this rather than a normal distribution. If I overlay one on the other and take in some liberties with statistics, it looks like this. So the amount of stuff in the center of the distribution is now radically reduced, and the tails are very, very fat. Now that actually means when I measure in risk, that failure is inevitable. And that's why people like bell curves, because they say you can prevent failure. Yeah, but the only way you can get a bell curve is to reduce the variables. When you deal with the reality of the human condition, you're dealing with very fat tails, which means the most important thing is early detection, fast recovery, rather than failure prevention. This is one of the big problems in hospitals and social care, yeah, and teaching, to be honest, in that we're trying to stop all failure. And because we're trying to stop all failure, people don't report failure early enough, so when failure happens, it's catastrophic. And we punish people for failure, so they go into avoidance. When actually in these spaces, you are going to fail some of the time. You can't avoid it. Yeah, what's interesting is apprentice models of learning pick this up faster. I go walking with 3 doctors. When I told my wife, one of them, by the way, is called Di Lazarus, which is the best name I've ever known for a doctor. Di is the Welsh for David, and it's a chapel environment. So Di Lazarus is a wonderful name, all right? My wife said this was wonderful, but she said I was safe. And I said, no, 1 doctor is good. 3 doctors is a nightmare, because if I have an accident, it will take them 3 hours to agree what should happen. And if I've died, it will take them another 3 hours to argue about it. That's the nature of doctors, all right? They go around arguing constantly, right? But actually what's interesting, 2 of them are retired for stress reasons for the NHS. And they say they don't want to be operated by anybody under the age of 50. Because what happened at that point is the old apprentice model by which surgeons had teams and they learned and looked after each other was moved into a process re-engineering approach in which you were given roles and designation and teams were assembled. And so that capacity to learn and learn through failure has been destroyed in the system. In fact, apprentice models are one of the most important things to bring back at the moment, yeah, because they're the only way we found to genuinely transfer tacit knowledge. Yeah, you can't do it any other way. You can mitigate it. Yeah? Now, the consequence of this, and this is how I often start to, if I'm doing a board level presentation, I'll normally start with this, because the financial people get this one. Yeah? Basically, this stuff here, this stuff here is fine. And they're both distributions. What I've got here is a symmetrical relationship between the past and the future. Nothing is going to happen in the future which hasn't already happened in the past, or only with minor variations. So I can use the past to make decisions about the future. This is ordered in Canevin terms. And here I should be able to assess the probability of any event with a high degree of accuracy. So this is a nice area. It's planned, it's determined. As I move out from this, life gets more difficult. So now under a normal distribution, yeah, as I go into the Gaussian, everything is increasing. So what I'm getting here is increasing asymmetry between past and future. So some things are happening the same way, but many things are mutating, and I'm getting increased novelty. Yeah, but the past is still important. So at this point, I can use things like scenario planning, cone of possibilities, contingency planning, all those sort of things we know and love. And what I'm dealing with here is anything which is possible. But of course, the set of things which are possible is much higher than the set of things which is probable, which is why those things cost more money. But up until this point, in both directions, I can take an approach based on hypotheses. Because a hypothesis is based on projecting what you understand about the past onto the future in the main. As I move over here, life gets very interesting. Because now I've got massive asymmetry between past and future. So nothing which happened in the past is occurring again in the future without mutation, and there's increasing novelty. Yeah, so it means here I have to deal with anything which is plausible. And possible, plausible is effectively an exponential growth. And that's why I can't prevent failure. Because the sheer number of things I've got to deal with is so high that what really matters is I've got multiple sensors in place so I can see things going wrong fast. Yeah, that's the difference. You switch effectively from trying to prevent failure to sense failure fast, and you create mechanisms for early sharing of failure within social networks. And by the way, crews do that very well. This is Vike and Sutcliffe's work. Yeah, in that actually crews share failure because it's the role sharing the failure, not the person. The mistake Vike and Sutcliffe make, which is a classic mistake of classical sense-making, is they study crews and say you can take the behavior from firefighting crews and apply it on a day-to-day basis in the office. And Carl has never forgiven me for saying at one conference, yes, you can do that, but I don't want to have to burn my office down every morning to create the same context, all right? There are times when you should avoid the British parliamentary tradition in debate with respected academics in the US, all right? But I still stand by the statement, all right? Now, this is quite important because this is order, this is complex, and down here you get to chaos. So it's another way of looking at that framework, but it basically says we have to work in different ways. So what we do here is variously called abductive research, which contrasts with inductive. Inductive is case-based. Remember I satirized that a bit yesterday? Yeah, inductive said deductive, if A, then B. Right at the center of that, you can say that more or less, all right? Then it goes, all the cases of A we've seen so far have got B. That's inductive. Yeah. Abductive is sometimes known as the logic of hunches. It's the great contribution of the American pragmatist to philosophy, right? And the big problem in abductive research has been how is your intuitive connection between unconnected things more accurate than my intuitive connection between unconnected things? Remember when I talked about what we do with mass sense yesterday? Where we present the data to thousands of agents and we draw the maps. That's abductive research. Because you can see dominant views and outlier views with a degree of objectivity. But that means you have to have diverse networks you can deploy in real time very quickly, because your response time in this field is not measured in the timescales of traditional research of any type. Which is why you build human sensor networks using your employees, your customers, your workforce, your networks, so that you can use them in real time, yeah, to actually assess threats, to assess opportunity. So that's important, that's background to what I was talking about yesterday with Sensemaker. But it's also true that when you get to this phase, when something crosses that boundary, you've got an opportunity to innovate. If something's here, forget it. Yeah, everything is stable. Right, now I'm going to build that when I come on to apex predator theory, which I will do now. Just going to make sure I get a copy of this, which I did. Okay, so that will go on the slides. Okay, so don't know whether you've ever seen this picture before. If you look at dogs in the wild, there are 2 or 3 minor variations in the species. If you domesticate anything, after 7 generations, it's got massive diversity in it, but actually you've got major genetic weaknesses and the species are weak. Yeah? And that's important to understand, all right? The more you, it's a paradox, all right? The more you codify stuff, the more you structure it, it produces what appears to be variety, but it actually really isn't variety, it's just name gaming. And my favorite phrase, how many people know Lord of the Rings? Yeah, okay, so I grew up on this, all right? We used to read it 3 times a year at university, so you knew the name of the second elf that Frodo met with you. Yeah, this is sad, right? Famous phrase when they argue about different types of hobbit to Elrond, and he says, doubtless to sheep other sheep appear different or to shepherds, but we have made no study of them. Yeah? It's one of the best put-downs I've ever seen in literature, all right? It's a brilliant one. Yeah? And this is actually one of the problems you see at the end of a meta-theory of consultancy, is it starts to diversify and claim huge differences, but actually it's that domestication stage, it's a non-resilient type of approach. So we saw this when systems thinking came in the 80s, it produced 2 major dominant popular forms. One was business process re-engineering, the other was learning organization, both from the same source, both top-down. Yeah, Peter Senge says the role of the board is to define the values and everybody else will conform with them. Yeah, the metaphor of the ship. Yeah, and what you've actually got is a classic dichotomy. The things that it's a Kantian dichotomy. The things we can engineer, business process re-engineering, all the soft stuff, learning organization. And that distinction has perpetuated itself. You see it in methods, you see it in tools. Despite a huge amount of variety, you know, blue ocean strategy, red ocean strategy. Please don't get me onto holacracy, right? You know, designed by IT people who can't cope with making judgments, so they write a system so they can avoid any management responsibility, all right? It's failing in a very large way. And by the way, Lacroix's book, Reinventing the Organization, is a classic example of really, really bad research. Because he actually has a thesis, and he only uses the aspects of the cases which support his thesis. And he ignores the bits which don't. And that's increasingly common in management literature. People are coming in with something they think will be popular. Malcolm Gladwell does it in Blink. Yeah, a very popular idea, and then he goes and finds the evidence support the idea and ignores the stuff that don't. Yeah, there's a whole book being produced called The Invisible Gorilla to try and combat Blink. Yeah, from the cognitive neuroscience community, because actually human intuition is really very, very bad considered individually. Yeah, in terms of the way it works. Yeah? So either way, the danger is, and this is actually one of the signs, when something becomes highly commoditized, highly structured, it's coming to the end of its days and there's a chance to introduce something completely novel and new. Yeah? And again, this goes with Clayton Christensen's point. It's actually when you become highly competent and you dominate the market, you fail not because you're incompetent, but you're too competent at the old paradigm. Yeah? So, if I look at apex predator theory, yeah, what I'm going to do is to draw this. Yeah, I just thought you could see a Deo workshop, so you've got the horror in background, all right? These things are so regimented now. I tell you, I took part in one of these, all right? And we caught the scribes on each table writing down what they'd worked out in advance, we would say, rather than what we actually said. Because actually they were more concerned to deliver what the client said they wanted than to discover novelty. And that's one of the big problems with consultancy drivers. I found that in IBM. You'd say, but this is what's the right thing. They say, no, but the client doesn't want to hear that, and it's more important we get the next contract. Yeah, and that is that cynical, all right? But it does worry me because there's a change agency thing in this. And it's a lot, the trouble is it's often subconscious. Yeah, in terms of the way it works, which is an issue for consultancy management, yeah, in terms. And by the way, sideline on that, look at a consultancy partner ratio if you want to see whether you've got a dynamic group or not. McKinsey's used to be 1 to 5 between partner and consultant. Now they're 1 to 60. At that point, you're in a manufacturing model, not an apprentice model. Yeah, it's one of the key indicators of whether you're going to get innovation or not. Yeah, is the partner to consultant ratio. And the trouble is, rates are going down, so numbers are going up. and they're driving up utilization. The other question to ask a consultancy is, what's your utilization rate? If the utilization of junior consultants is over 60%, don't work with them. Yeah, because at that point, there's no room for education, renewal ideas, and people will only want to work on large projects with stable utilization. So there are certain indications you can look for on this, yeah? And they're kind of like warning signs. Either way, what I'm going to do is to combine two models, yeah? So the apex predator concept is simple. The wolf I showed you earlier is a timber wolf from North America. Now, when timber wolves were hunted out of Yellowstone, it caused a trophic cascade because they're the apex predator. It meant deer could proliferate, which meant deer grazed riverbanks, which meant water tables got destroyed by silt, yeah, and everything went wrong. That's called a trophic cascade. Yeah? When they reintroduced prairie wolves, and if you actually type on Yellowstones and wolves, it's a lovely little film, one pack of wolves, and within a few years, the water ran clean again. Now, the thing about apex predators is actually this ecosystem evolves around them, so they actually survive no matter how incompetent they are until the ecosystem changes, at which point they don't survive because they're over-optimized. Yeah, so the dinosaurs do really well until a meteor comes along. And that's another gaping void cartoon, by the way. Don't try and sell a meteor to a dinosaur, it will only offend. It's my second favorite of all time, right? Yeah, it wipes out most of the dinosaurs. If you had to predict who would be the next predator, you go for the crocodile or the shark because they survive. You wouldn't go for the first proto-mammal. But actually, when the ecosystem disrupts, it's something small and highly energy efficient that emerges and then dominates the system. Yeah, and that always surprises people because they weren't expecting it. Okay, so that's the key concept. So what I'm going to do is to combine two things, market life cycle and S-curves. Yeah? Now, you've all seen a market life cycle curve. It looks like that. And you basically got, this is called early adopters, 2.5% of the total market. These are reasonably well validated figures. Right? You then get early majority, which is 13.5%. And if you control this space, everything else is yours. This is the key point, all right? If you get dominant market share here, people will always buy the apex predator. Yeah? You then get this grot, which is a late majority. I can never remember the percentage there. Then you get these guys, which are called laggards, or I call them really sad people, who only buy things right at the end of the cycle when nobody else has bought it. Now, a guy called Geoffrey Moore in the book called Crossing the Chasm, which I really recommend, his second book wasn't as good, but this is a brilliant one, said actually it doesn't look like that. It actually looks like this. The early adopter peak comes much faster because these are the guys, you know them, all right? They're the ones who queue outside the Apple store regardless of whether it's going to work or not because they've got to have the latest thing. They're the people who never drive their car because they're far too concerned to take it apart and put it back together every weekend, right? You know those types? Yeah? They like things to go wrong. I mean, that's the irony, right? They're a nightmare if you're selling software because they always know how you should have designed it, yeah, because they could have done it better, yeah? These are a nightmare. You do not want to sell to these guys. They consume a huge amount of resource and you get nowhere. Yeah? The trouble is people think they go there. They then project sales like this, and of course it doesn't happen because at this point these guys are waiting to see what works. Yeah, they want first mover advantage. They don't want to do the risky experiment. They don't want multiple cases. In fact, if somebody says, give me 5 cases of companies like me, that's a late majority buying behavior. Yeah, so you don't sell something new. Again, this is the context stuff. Yeah. But again, you want to try and dominate that space. Oh, and by the way, the thing I made my name on, which is why IBM bought the company I was strategy director of, is how do you sell on the other side of the chasm? So how do you sell something completely new, yeah, on the other side of the chasm? And you do it by creating a symbiote onto something that people already want to buy. So you add something non-risky to something people are already doing, which then starts, it acts like a retrovirus. It starts to change the DNA of its host so that it becomes a novel thing. And that turned the company around. That's another lecture on another day. The other thing you've all seen are S-curves. Ever seen S-curves? Okay, so what I did many years ago is combine them. So what it actually looks like is this. You get the early adopter hype, then you get the trough, then you get the S-curve. That's the adoption pattern. Yeah, so that's a variation. Yeah. What I then said is the reason you get the trough is the previous idea has reached maturity. So there's always space for something completely novel, yeah, as the old idea comes to the end of its cycle. But the trouble is, because the old idea is so dominant, it's difficult to displace it. Yeah? So you have two key moments here. This is the moment, the ideal moment where you can innovate. And this is competence-induced failure. And you've got this very narrow window where you can change. And that's why established companies don't succeed, because by the time they see something, they're already past that. So let me give you my favorite example on that. IBM dominate computing from the 40s onwards. Remember exaptation? Because they repurpose punch cards from sewing machines to give them the first advantage in computer systems. Yeah, and that exaptation point, yeah, if you want to get early advantage, you accept, you don't adapt. Yeah? After that, they're the apex predator. Nobody gets fired for buying IBM. You can have better kit, better equipment, better software. You will not win against IBM because they're in a late majority market. They're the apex predator. All you can do is serve them. You can be an IBM accredited supplier or produce complementary material. Yeah, there's no point in competing. Then what happens is hardware becomes a commodity. And IBM doesn't notice it because they're the apex predators, so they're still commanding margin. By the time they notice it, it's too late. Yeah, and they almost went under. They sort of recovered, but never at the same level. Interestingly, the entire European computer industry went under then. Yeah, Bull, yeah, Hoskins, Siemens survived, but only in medical machinery. Yeah, we completely lost at that point because we were stuck in an old paradigm. British car industry went under in a similar pattern. Okay. Now, what happens then is, guess who the next dominant predator is? Microsoft. Exaptation, they repurposed some code they'd stolen from somebody else and developed for IBM. IBM didn't think software was significant, so they gave them the IP. That became Windows. Then software became a commodity. And then we get Apple. And what Apple realized, my favorite phrase from anthropology, what we really want are objects of material desire. Yeah, we want something beautiful that does something we didn't know we needed, but now we need desperately. And what Apple realized is you couldn't care less about hardware and software being separate. You just want something which does the job. So we go from hardware to software to ecosystem. And in each case, a very small energy efficient thing takes over. This is also scarily what's happened politically. What neoliberalism did, it homogenized, it commoditized political choice so that energy efficient things like Trump and the far right could move into a space because there was insufficient variety in the system. Yeah, so lack of variety or the pseudo variety of high specialization, those are signs. So lesson number 1 on new approaches to design thinking, what's the context? Yeah? Innovation here is modify or augment. Innovation here is radical. So even what you're going to design changes. Yeah, what the objective is based on context. So that's kind of like lesson number 1. Now, if you're actually in one of these apex predator movements, then this is a phrase from Lincoln. You might remember that from it's the post-Gettysburg speech. He addressed to Congress. As the times are anew, we need to think anew, we need to act anew. Now, I put that up a lot because notice the two. It's think and act. It's not act or just think. The two go together. That's the praxis concept again. Yeah? So the 3 things that we've developed on this. Now, this is kind of like phase 2, but I've already explained this stuff, so I'm just going to highlight it now. One is distributed ethnography. That's another word for abductive research. It's another word for mass capture. All right, so let me give you a couple of examples. We're now working on requirement specification. Right? Because actually what we're interested in software now is unarticulated needs, not articulated needs. If you want to innovate, you actually want to know what people don't know they need, not what they say they need. Because the things that people say they need, you can already supply. Yeah? And the trouble is when you send out, systems analysts or inquirers, or you do what IDEO called ethnography, which is not ethnography, it's just a few interviews and a bit of observation, right? That's not ethnography. Ethnography is deep immersion over long periods of time. Yeah? All you get is the superficial stuff, the surface stuff. So you can see where we're going with this, all right? So for example, we'll take 10% of the workforce and we'll get them to tell stories every time they get frustrated, every time they think there's something they could do. We're capturing the micro frustrations of day-to-day living over extended periods of time. And from that, we draw the fitness landscapes, and then we put pair programming teams onto clusters of narrative and say, could you do something to help this? Because the reality is, technology is moving faster than people know what to ask for. Yeah, so the idea you've got this linear process by people say, I want to do this, and technology provides it, that doesn't work because people don't know what technology can do. It can do far more than they think. Yeah, so by actually gathering the requirement as fragmented narrative, the triads again, forcing up a level of abstraction, you then give clusters of those to people who really understand the technology, and they can build prototypes, and then you use that to test. Now, same with triads, I'm giving you an IT example, but that's more general. Yeah? You map unarticulated needs by getting close to the day-to-day frustrations and issues that people have, but by allowing them to self-interpret, and you want large volumes, you don't want an expert doing it, because the expert goes in with a set of filters in terms of the way they do interviews. If you don't know it, if you conduct more than 2 interviews, sorry about this for anybody who does it, after 2 interviews, your brain forms a subconscious hypothesis, and you literally only hear things that match that hypothesis thereafter. Yeah, and sorry, you can't train yourself not to do that. You might get up to 3 or 4, yeah, but you won't get beyond that. And again, that's just reality. Yeah. Okay, so that's one thing. Next thing is distributed ideation. This is getting more advanced. I then take those clusters and put the prototypes up and some ideas, and I throw that out to thousands of people who actually add narrative and interpret it in real time, and I look at the clusters. Now that actually means instead of a linear process by which we go and gather the data, then we have the ideations, then we build the product, I can now do that in a continuous parallel process in which ethnography interacts with ideation in multiple patterns and then tests. That's non-linear, fast, and involves much larger numbers of people. And then we get exaptive connections. Remember exaptation? Yeah, how do I find things that I already know how to do, which could do something I didn't realize they could do? I gave you the examples yesterday of, microwave ovens. The other one I love is how many people have repurposed things to open beer bottles in hotel bars late at night? Yeah, if you want an example of exaptation, just look back in your career history on this, all right? It's amazing what I've repurposed over the years, all right? We're very good as a species. And then we get scaffolding. All right, so I'm going to do them in reverse order. I'm going to start with scaffolding. This has been the final building block because I've been trying to get everything together to write the book, and I wanted everything together for the book. This is the final bit. Yeah? The issue in a complex system is, what do I design? Because I've got to do something. I've got to have something that I put in place. Yeah, I can't just stand alone. Scaffolding is it. I don't design the system. I design scaffolding so the system can be built. And depending on the degree of knowledge I have, I can use different types of scaffolding. So this is where we currently are on this, which is the typology of 5 different types of scaffolding. Now, top left, you can see the classic, all right? This is bamboo scaffolding. I'm putting that in deliberately. If anybody's been to Hong Kong, they just throw up bamboo poles, yeah? It's actually far more resilient than the steel, but it takes more time to learn how to do it. It's a classic apprentice model. Yeah, I've got more resilience and flexibility, but there's higher training overload. Steel, I've got less flexibility, but lower training overload. And it's a balance. Which do you do? Yeah? I'm in favour of bamboo, but I have a prejudice in that direction anyway. Right? So that means I kind of like know what the building's got to look like, or I'm repairing the building, so I'm putting up a structure, but there's some variation allowed within it. Yeah? We then move bottom left. This is a nutrient lattice. So if you have a burn in any major hospital these days, people will put a nutrient lattice over the burn, which creates a scaffolding around which the skin can regrow. And basically, the lattice contains skin nutrients which dissolve into the skin, so the thing disappears as it happens. Yeah? Start to think of that as a metaphor, because that's what we're using this for. Is that's putting something in place which will disappear gradually over time, but will create some structure. Yeah? And a variation of that, which is top right, that's actually this is actually fascinating, this stuff. This is stuff people actually put in the heart, and it dissolves into the heart and leaves a trace of electrical filaments in the heart to get the heart to run. So it's an organic way of implanting technology. And again, you can start to see the metaphor here. So that's kind of like a basic typology. We kind of like know what we want, minor variations. We're not sure what we want, but we want it to disappear. We want to put something in place because we think it's important. We're not sure how to do it. And what's interesting, if you have, this is where you do use workshops, metaphors are really powerful to get people to think in novel ways. Yeah? So that's kind of like a basic thing. Then we get to which are more interesting. So the kayaking, this is called a shadow scaffolding. So that's an extreme sports guy. Have anybody seen these guys in reality? Yeah. I mean, what they do is incredible. I thought, what I did in mountains was scary, all right? But these are ridiculous, all right? If you actually see that before they go down the waterfall, they're moving their hands and they're paddling micro movements. They're actually mentally rehearsing the whole pathway down. Physical rehearsal. Yeah? But the scaffolding to enable that happens has taken decades to develop. It's infrastructure, training, technology, apprentice schemes, experience, maps, conversations. You can't design something for extreme sports. It's going to have to evolve. Right? So if you want that behavior, you've got time. Right? And if you've already got something in place, you disturb it at your peril. Yeah, so if you try and codify something which has evolved over time, you've got to be very careful because you may destroy the very thing which is creating it. And then you get the keystone. We're still playing with this one. About the second group I've talked to about this. Keystone is important because there you have scaffolding in place until you put the keystone in, and then the structure is highly stable. Yeah, so there's like a key element, and your whole scaffolding is to get ready to get the key element in, but you can't do that to the last moment. And that's actually quite a good metaphor if you think about it. Yeah, but it's also a reverse one because anybody been to the catacombs in Rome? Okay, there's a lot of arches down there. How much is built on top of it? You take one keystone down there, everything might collapse. Yeah, and that's another mapping metaphor, is what are the underlying things in your culture where if you made one small change, you could cause this catastrophic failure in the system. Yeah, which is, again, is the argument for nudging, yeah, rather than designing, yeah, in terms of the way it works. Now, I haven't spent long on that because actually it's a really simple concept. It just took us a whole year to get there and multiple workshops because simple things take time. Complicated things can be thrown together in PowerPoint by consultants before they meet a client, but simple things take a lot of time. Yeah? So kind of like step 2, you do your distributed ethnography, distributed ideation, you start to focus on the type of scaffolding, then you start to build the scaffolding and see what emerges around that with a fast response mechanism. Yeah? This is a whole new approach, if you think about it, to organizational design, which allows you to create things so the scaffolding might emerge or disappear at different rates in different countries, or it might be different. The key thing in complexity is for things to be coherent, not for them to conform. That's a really important difference in English. So coherence is really important in philosophy of science. So I can say, for example, evolutionary theory, we know kind of like a lot of it's wrong, we're still learning, but it's coherent to the facts. Young Earth creationism is incoherent to the facts and not worth exploration. Yeah, so coherence is a really important point in politics and in organizational change. Which hypotheses are coherent and which are incoherent? I don't have to agree you're right, I just have to agree your idea is coherent, which means it's worth exploring. And that's the big conflict resolution thing I talked about yesterday. Out of all of that is fundamentally granularity matters. One of the key things in complexity. This is kind of like, I call this the three bears hypothesis. You all know the story of Goldilocks and the three bears? It has to be just right. So getting the granularity right is key. If I look at the radar's too big. Yeah, the valves are too small, the magneto is just right. Now the interesting thing is when you look at people's micronarrative or you give them freedom, they tend to get the granularity right instinctively. The minute you give them too much structure, they tend to create big things which miss stuff. The other point I'm making here, by the way, is you don't scale a complex system by aggregation or imitation. So if something works, you don't imitate it or create more of it. Complex systems scale by decomposition and recombination. It's like DNA, right? The whole of organic life form comes from 4 chemicals in different combinations. So decomposition and recombination is one of the ways you scale across an organization. So you keep coherence on the granules and coherence on the linkages, but you allow different forms to construct. Yeah? Effectively what you do is you create an endoskeleton, not an exoskeleton. Yeah, so an external skeleton on an insect, very little variety. An endoskeleton on a human, huge amount of variety, but a coherent structure. That's another way of looking at scaffolding, internal or external. Okay, so to finish off on this, I'm partly putting this stuff up so you've got it in the slides, all right? This is kind of like something I developed for the SAGE Handbook on Organizational Change. So I got to write the section on organizational narrative, which is fun. So I can now quote myself in Wikipedia without getting into trouble, right? And several of my colleagues were furious about this, all right? I divided stories into, this is a triad, yeah? Storytelling is either about communication, recording, or understanding. Yeah? And if you look at the field, understanding and recording is where people create use cases in IT. Yeah, and understanding what's going on and creating things that people can design to. Communication reporting is the whole organizational storytelling movement, which has good aspects and bad aspects. Then I've got basically action-based research, communication, yeah, and understanding. And what we're doing with the distributed ethnography is combine all 3 of those. And I've drawn that as a spider's web behind it. Like, you know, this is a sort of messy thing in terms of the way it works. So that's generally trying to position narrative work. So some points to emphasize. Micro-narrative is more important than grand narrative. Yeah, culture is determined by the water cooler stories, not by the stories told in workshops with managers present. Yeah? And there's also a thing called an anti-story, which is a story which arises to destroy the good story, but you never get to hear them because they've been told around the water cooler. Yeah? And they're actually quite scary when you see them. Yeah? Generally, if an executive's gone on broadcast some wonderful story about the future, all of the stories we capture over the next week are anti-stories. Yeah, they're actually, oh, he would say that, wouldn't he? But what did he do yesterday? Yeah, and actually the hypocrisy thing is a big thing here. Conceptual blending, I said yesterday, we make decisions by blending together our own micro stories and those of other people we recall. So knowledge management systems need to be fragmented and allow blending based on abstraction. Yeah, too much structure, you don't get it. Description is safer than evaluation. It's a big problem with 360 feedback. You ask people to evaluate something and it causes stress and they go into performance mode. You ask them to describe it's different. So what we do on 360 is a leader nominates any number of people. Every time those people interact, they describe the interaction. And they index it onto 6 triangles, all of which have positive qualities, so they can't say anything negative about the leader. But then leader can see which of the positive qualities are absent over the body of the stories, which allows them to say, what can I do tomorrow to create more like this, fewer like that? Or sit down with their employees and say, I want to create more like this, fewer like that. What do you suggest I do? You've got micro-intervention on a descriptive, not evaluative basis, on a continuous basis, rather than the once-a-year trauma of HR-mediated 360. You see the description, not evaluation? Yeah? You really want to focus on that. Tropes, not memes. I hate the word memes. And it comes from genes. The concept there's a story which seeks to replicate itself is just wrong. Just like the idea of the selfish gene is denied by every geneticist I know. Yeah, it's far more complex than that. The English word is a trope. It's a pattern of stories which you find difficult to escape. Yeah, now this is actually assemblage theory in Deleuze, which is huge at the moment in medical science. And my daughter's working on this on the work we're doing on well-being and mental health. Yeah, is basically as you tell stories, you like stories which match your stories, and you tell stories which match those stories. And there's a point where those stories become what Deleuze called an assemblage, which exists independently of the storytellers, and you can't escape the pattern. That's also called a strange attractor in complexity theory. And the trouble with the internet is the interaction bonds faster and faster, and you can't escape it. A friend of mine in the Canadian Mounties had a wonderful phrase for this. He said it used to be that every village had an idiot, and it didn't matter because we knew who the idiots were. But now the idiots have banded together on the internet to legitimize idiocy and elect the President of the United States. And it's actually scarily close to the truth, right? What the internet has done is create an unbuffered feedback loop, which means assemblages, perverted assemblages, form very quickly. And there's no point in arguing with somebody in that assemblage because you make it worse. Yeah, so stop using words like memes. Think tropes, assemblages, strange attractors are kind of like more important. Questionnaires, focus groups, these kind of like are all problematic, all right? I went through that yesterday, so that's a reminder. And I thought I'd give you the data on why targets don't work. This is from a meta-study of all available science on human motivation, where people are working for explicit goals, it destroys intrinsic motivation. Yeah? This is a fitness landscape. This is civilian manufacture. This is military. This dimension de facto, and of course, remember these are probability distributions, so they're indications. This, if you look at the underlying thing, basically says this is about keeping the rules, and this is about getting the job done. Now, one of the principles, and this is again a big difference between complexity thinking and systems thinking, you need an expert to interpret a systems thinker's model. You don't need an expert to interpret this. You can immediately see the pattern. Decision makers have got to understand what the model means without the need for expert interpretation. That's critical. Yeah? Here, you can see you either get the job done or you follow the rules. All of the surveys, all of the focus groups say they're doing both because people know they're meant to be doing both, and they know if they say they're not, they'll get a change initiative, and they've had too many of those. Yeah? We got that out of a narrative. Yeah? Now, nobody on the board challenged this when I showed it because they knew it. This one looks better. This is military because I've got this pattern here. Rule compliance, job completion. Trouble is when you click on that, remember we click on these and we see the stories? All of those stories are about nuclear weapons testing, which creates an existential quality to job completion and rule compliance which can't translate anywhere else. You've got get the job done and ignore the roles, and you've got I've given up. That's the pattern we're seeing with nurses and social workers. In a crisis, everything is wonderful. On a day-to-day basis, the good ones break the rules to get the job done, but increasingly, they're in survival mode, and if that got to be that big, the system would go through a phase shift, and it would take you years to recover. Again, this is this issue about lead indicators, which is key. Now, the other thing to understand about this is that what we want to do is manage things fractally. Remember self-similar all the way down? Normal metaphor for that, by the way, is the Norwegian coast. It doesn't matter what level you look at it. Yeah, it's fiddly. Yeah? Right, so remember that picture I just showed you? That's the board level picture. That's the picture for every factory from the same source data. So whereas here, what I need to do, and this is a vector, this is an adjacent possible. It's a small pattern near to where I am. So the board level have to move in that direction. That's a vector. Now the prompt here, we said to the board, what can you do tomorrow to create more like these, fewer like those? Not what can the employees do, but what can you do? And they created a rule by which if you had 10 years experience and somebody with 5 years experience signed it off, you could break any rule. And that hugely improved safety. Yeah, so they worked out something they could do, which would make a difference, and they stopped talking about what other people should do. What they didn't try and do is get everybody up there. Then each factory had their own framework. So as you can see, if you look at this one, they probably, interestingly, need to reduce the amount of job completion to increase rule compliance. This one, kind of like they can move there, they can move there, they can move there. You see the pattern? Everybody's asking that question, what can I do tomorrow to create more like this, fewer like that, at the level of their own competence to make a difference, rather than having a program which runs over the whole company, which just deals with the center of the distribution. This actually means people making appropriate decisions. So that's the concept of fractality. And finally, exaptive incubation. This is one we've done several times now. On the left, you've got user stories gathered continuously. On the right, you've got all of your capabilities, which is a knowledge audit done within Sensemaker, so people take the capabilities. We did this with a big lighting company. So the left is stories about people's gardens. The right is all of the technologies the lighting company have, and they're all indexed with the same set of triangles. Now, so I've shifted what we know with what the customers have on a day-to-day problem into a high level of abstraction, and then combine the two. And when I get a pattern of customer stories which match a technology, I go and look at it and say, why are those associated? And one of the products we got for this, which I'm ashamed to have created, is a colored plastic rock which changes color in your garden based on human proximity. And that actually uses a lighting filament designed to handle staircases in a football stadium where they're suffering continuous running urine. Right? Nobody had thought about that, but the technology moves sideways. Yeah, so that's kind of like what we call managed serendipity, and of course you can introduce novel factors. Yeah? That's stage 3 of design, where you start to automate over a very large volume of distributed ethnography, distributed ideation, with your own existing capability, and throw the patterns together and say, why are these linked? Rather than hoping that some people will discover it. And that's one of the ways we overcome the lack of specialists. So, to conclude, 3 groups of 3 things to know about complexity. First question you ask is, what can I change? You then say, out of the things that I can change, where can I monitor the impact of the change? Because it would be stupid to change if you can't see what happens. And where, if I can monitor it, can I rapidly amplify success or kill things off if they don't work? That's the simplest approach. Then 3 basic questions, how you do it. Reduce the granularity. Well, it's optimized, but generally it's reduce. Most people are using with 2 big things. Smaller units count. Distribute the cognition. That's the distributed ideation. Lots of people from different perspectives looking at the problem. And critically, disintermediate the decision maker. The decision maker goes direct from an abstract representation to the raw data without any interpretive layers. And I often say HR departments have got a Stockholm syndrome relationship with the CEO. They get upset when I say that, but you can work it out, all right? And that they're creating structures that the CEO can't escape. I did that at a recent conference, and the worrying thing is 3/3 of the OR consultants didn't know what I meant and had to look it up on the internet, which is deeply depressing, right? Then 3 things to avoid. Retrospective coherence. Looking backwards, remember the dots? Premature convergence, coming too quickly to a solution. Remember liminality, you hold things for as long as you can before you commit. And then finally, pattern entrainment. You're going to get that, so you've got to live with it. So, another gaping void cartoon, that was this morning's. Culture is a part of the problem, but it's not the whole problem. If the culture isn't going in the right direction, the car won't work, but it's not the only thing in the system. The trouble is it gets blamed for everything. And if anybody wants more data, this is actually the latest article. It's on a healthcare focus. That actually combines Cynefin with Sensemaker. So that's kind of like the detailed academic structure. But I really wish they wouldn't call it that. And finally, I thought I'd finish with another picture. Right? Remember we started with dogs? Well, as you probably realised from yesterday, we're a cat household. So this is from my favourite story in Rudyard Kipling, the cat who walked by himself and all places were alike unto him. So the cat accepts that it's quite useful to do some things in the cave, but he still goes out into the wet wild wood and takes the consequences, right? It's a really good metaphor for what you're trying to do in organizations, yeah? You don't want domesticated dogs, you want cats. Yeah, you want people who are comfortable in the wild and comfortable in the home, yeah, and all places must be alike unto you. Okay, I didn't manage to short the time, so I apologize for that, but you carried on paying attention, so I went with it. And that's kind of like it, all right? We'll make sure the slides are available. There are videos, there's other material. If you want to know how to create Kinevin, there's online courses for that and stuff like that, but we need to have a longer conversation about some of that stuff. Yeah. Okay, hope it was useful. Yeah, go on for that.